Hi everybody, and welcome to today's Art of Procurement podcast. We're actually recording live here at DPW 2024 in Amsterdam. And I'm delighted and honored to be joined by Sebastien Bals, Sebastien has enjoyed a career of over 20 years in procurement, varying different roles, locations, and industries. He's currently the Chief Procurement Officer for Merck, KGAA, a leading science and technology company based in Darmstadt, Germany. So Sebastien, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Phil. Thanks for having me.
Now, the first question that I always ask on the Art of Procurement is, did you find procurement or did procurement find you?
You know, I think it's not only you who ask that question all the time. I think it's, the answer is very clear. Procurement found me and I did not find procurement. Actually, I'm a marketing major by education. And so when I was graduating from my master's degree, I actually wanted to do something with product management.
Yeah.
And I applied for a graduate program. And the output or the two positions that you were basically could end up with was on one hand product management, and on the other hand was contracts management. Right. It was called back then. And so halfway through that trainee program, they basically said, with all due respect, but we don't see you in product management.
Right.
But we do believe that you would make a great person in procurement. And the funny thing was that actually I never heard about procurement. You know, we had a course when we were in college which would talk about supply chain. So we had some notion, but I never really understood what the people were doing there. So it was quite a quick onboarding at the start to get to that position. But I must say that afterwards, staying in procurement actually has been a deliberate choice.
That's not an unusual career path as well. I certainly had the same journey where I was placed in purchasing in the automotive industry with no clue of what purchasing was, having wanted to do something that I thought was more interesting, like marketing or operations or HR. And then once I got there, I stayed there. And I think that's one of the challenges for us is to make procurement more interesting for people to want to come and be a part of the procurement profession.
Yeah, but you know what is hopeful though is that if you walk around here at DPW over the past couple, I've been here since this morning, is the amount of young people that you see here, which for me indicates that people are now deliberately finding procurement rather than procurement finding you. I think I still come from a generation where procurement was seen as the box kickers and the label lickers in the organization, or the parking spots where we would put annoying people who were asking too many questions or who would be a bit more challenging.
Over there to keep it quiet.
Yes. Typically, we would even be in like a separate
in a different buildings.
Yes.
Yep.
We even still today we make a bit fun of it because my office in Darmstadt, it's actually on the ground floor right next to the entrance. So I see everybody walk in the morning and I feel like I'm the janitor, waiting until everybody leaves to turn off the lights.
Well, nobody can say that they weren't in the office today because you saw them walking right in.
They actually have to park in front of me. So in summer I've been thinking about putting a coffee machine or sell ice cream through my window. Yeah. Maybe that would be a way to attract people to procurement a bit more.
Now, you talk in your LinkedIn profile about being a spend entrepreneur. I just wonder if you could talk about what that means to you and how that kind of drives your approach to procurement.
If you think about what an entrepreneur actually does, so an entrepreneur, to a certain extent, he takes something and turns it into something greater.
Yeah.
And I think that is the same thing that we are doing in procurement. We take something, which in this case is spend, it's money, a resource, but we actually make something greater out of it. And for me, this is really, pushing the boundaries of thinking in how value creation in procurement can look like. So when I think about spend entrepreneur, it's about being innovative. It's about thinking outside of the box. It's pushing the boundaries. And here as well, again, for procurement, it's about pushing the boundaries beyond pure sourcing, beyond the traditional category management that we've been doing for so many years. So when I talk to my team about being a spend entrepreneur as well, what I want them to do is take whatever the business allows them to use, but do so much more with it than just spending it.
We talked as we were preparing for this conversation around the idea of your team being a service to the organization, looking at yourself as a business within a business, and then that drives some of the ways that you may, one, think about how you're building up your capabilities to serve the business, but then how you're serving the business. You don't necessarily have a right to exist within your organization. You have to earn that right to exist.
I think to a certain extent you're right. We often hear about this mandate topic that, procurement does not have the mandate, but I think there's more than just a reason for existence for procurement. to the point that I sometimes say to my team and to peers as well is like, when you interact with finance, at the end of that interaction, they don't come to you with like a paper that could you please sign that I've created value for you. When you go to HR, they don't come after your recruiting. Can you please approve that I created value? Yet for us in procurement, we still have this inferiority complex that we feel the need of getting this stamp of approval.
We have to demonstrate in a way because it's not obvious. We don't feel it's obvious to the people we helped what the value was we created for them.
No, and to be honest, I mean, ultimately it's very simple. As long as the company is willing to give me a budget to have a procurement department, it means that they see the value of it. And so there's no need for us to continuously prove that. And I think once we get over that hurdle, once we get over that step, we start flying without a net. I think right now we are flying, we're moving, but something is holding us back. And that's something that holds us back is also something that holds us back from achieving greatness.
Where do you think that inferiority complex comes from?
I don't know. Honestly, I think part of it comes from the fact that, the role that we play is not a nice one. To a certain extent, you have our stakeholders who want to do something. Just put yourself in the context when you were a kid and you wanted to do something. The last thing you wanted to do is your parents saying you can't do that.
Yeah.
That didn't feel comfortable. To a certain extent, for many years, we have been that policeman.
Yeah.
And so I think that through being that policeman, we've gotten so much negative feedback over us. To the point I had a former chief HR. I was sharing with him about this constant struggle that we have within the organization to keep people engaged and motivated. He said, if you want to be loved, Sebastien, buy a dog. They will give you unconditional love.
Yeah.
You won't get it in procurement. You don't have to search for it in procurement. Because it's not part of your job. But I think that being said, that over the past couple of years, if you look at the impact and the value we have been creating, it's amazing. If you look at how procurement departments across many organizations have pulled them through pandemic, I think nobody will disagree that we have been there for them.
We've proved their impact.
Yes.
We've proved our impact.
But the problem is that we've all gotten a seat at the table. The question is, will we keep that seat at the table? And I think that will now come into play in the next coming years is how do we now take the center stage that we have been given and how do we shine at that performance?
And demonstrate that we're not just about the short-term activities that we undertook to help our organizations through the pandemic, that is something that procurement can do, but that's not everything that procurement can do, because the risk is you get brought in as the SWAT team whenever there's an emergency, and when all of a sudden the business cycle changes, conditions look a bit better, we're thinking more about innovation and investment, that procurement gets put back in the box as to, well, we don't really need you now, we'll call on you when we need you to save some money.
It's a bit Ghostbusters, who you gonna call? Ghostbusters.
Yep.
When you have a problem, who do you gonna call? And I think that's an image that we still, I think it's good that we have that pull to a certain extent. But again, like I said, I think we need to elevate ourselves. We often see ourselves still as a support function.
Yeah.
We're still called a support function.
Yeah.
But actually, if you talk to the people in operations, they will argue that you're an integral part of the entire value chain of your organization. If you think about it, the value that we can create through our suppliers. If you look at Merck, we have about 66% of our cost base is spent with suppliers. More than 50% of the emissions of the company goes to Scope 3. And the more than 150,000 SKUs that we buy is generating 100% of the revenue. There's nothing small in what we do.
No, the third parties or suppliers are the backbone and foundation of most organizations. And that's not going to go away.
No, and what is interesting is you then look at how much time CEOs spend or head of commercial teams spend with their suppliers. Because ultimately, to your point, suppliers will be instrumental for the delivery of the strategy of a company.
Yeah.
So if you're a CEO, it's in your own personal interest to be close to those who will enable you to achieve that strategy, which are your suppliers. Yet if you look at the calendar, they spend all their time with customers. They spend all their time with boards and internal committees. but they barely spend time with suppliers. And that I find something that, a bit mind-blowing.
Yeah, and you think about, even for a company the size of Merck, that invests so much in R&D, the R&D capability of the supply base is exponentially larger than any one organization can do on their own, no matter how much they invest in R&D. And so harnessing that from a supply base, the way you harness that from the supply base, I know it's kind of cliche, but it can be a competitive advantage because there's so much innovation out there that you want to be able to be the customer of choice, so that the market wants to innovate with you and not innovate with your competitors.
But the customer of choice starts by having a strong relationship.
Yeah.
I think some of the, you could read during the pandemic or when they had the semiconductor crisis, for example, that, the CEO of TSMC, he suddenly started getting phone calls from presidents and heads of state.
Yeah.
Before that, nobody knew his name or number.
Or even the company name, probably.
No. And so how do you want that when you're in trouble, how do you then want somebody to support you if that relationship, that foundation is not there? And I think that's very important. I think if anything, procurement is far more evolving towards relationship managers rather than anything else.
Now, what is procurement's destiny? We hear there's a lot of conversation around, is procurement facing an existential crisis? Is technology going to come and replace? And we're surrounded here at DPW by technology. Is that technology going to replace the procurement professional? Kind of what's our path, do you feel?
I think there's two. I think one is the path that we're here at DPW to make procurement 10x.
Yeah.
That's one destiny. And I think the other path is actually towards the graveyard of dinosaurs. I do believe that procurement could be set up for extinction. If I just speak to the founders here at DPW, I think all of them in their own right, they don't say it to your face because you still need to buy the solution from them. But technically what they try to do is they try to put you out of business. Right. And so, I think on one hand you can see it as a threat or you can see it as an opportunity. I think I was speaking to somebody this morning. Apparently in the mid-teens, we had about 40 startups who were working on the procurement space. We now have more than 400 working on the procurement space. It just shows you how the market around us is evolving. And there's this book, The 48 Laws of Power, and one of the laws that they describe is how do you build, you can build a castle to protect you, but ultimately it will isolate you. And I think the same applies for us in procurement. If we choose to continue to build on our foundations from the past, and believe that they will make us successful in the future, I believe that the path to extinction is set. Because again, if we do not buy these solutions from these companies, they will stop coming to us trying to sell it, but go directly to our management or to our stakeholders. And they will buy it because they will prefer that one.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. I've been talking about that for a little while, and then the value proposition is different. So the value proposition to us as procurement leaders is we can help you be more efficient. We can help you repurpose your team into more high value adding work. We can help you with more decision intelligence. The pitch to the CFO or the CEO is, those procurement people that you don't really know what the value proposition is, you don't really need them because we've got technology that can replace them.
Yep.
And if we're not leading that, if we're not figuring out how can we take advantage of this to help our value proposition, that if we don't want to lose control of that conversation.
But Phil, I would even challenge that it's not only existing or underperforming procurement departments who are facing that path. I believe also the high-performing procurement teams today are actually prone to that destiny. Unfortunately, we're going through hurricane season right now in the US, but there's a picture I often use in my presentations, and it's about a bridge in Honduras, which was built to basically withstand hurricanes. And when a year later a hurricane hit Honduras, it did what it had to do. It withstood the hurricane. But what the hurricane did is it rerouted the river around the bridge, making the bridge totally useless. And for me, it's such a powerful picture that no matter how strong or how solid your foundations might be, the environment in which we operate is changing at such a pace that if we do not evolve with it, we will become obsolete. So I think that's one path, but I do believe that ultimately we'll go to the 10x path.
So how as a leader do you keep that front and foremost in your mind as you're thinking about the path that you're taking your team, to not rest on your laurels, even though you are kind of pushing what procurement can achieve and the value that you can achieve, but also not just saying, okay, that's a destination, we've got to that destination, let's pat ourselves on the back and we're safe. Like, how do you continue to kind of push what's next and what's next and what's next?
There's two answers to this, in my opinion. I mean, the first answer that I would give is that I don't lead a procurement team by myself. I have a leadership team around me, and we lead the procurement team together. Now, for me as a leader of the procurement team, it's actually not that hard. Why? Because my role is to think not about the challenges that we face today, but to think more about the challenge that we will face tomorrow or next year or in 5 years from now. The problem is not necessarily with me thinking down the road. The problem is, how do we find that right balance for the rest of the organization? And especially, it's very hard on my leadership team to find that right balance between having to deal with the urgencies and the challenges that we are facing today in the business, the crises that we are experiencing on a continuous basis, whilst at the same time still evolving and thinking outside of the box. So, I find it very challenging in our discussions to really set these types apart. And what we are trying to do, for example, is we have separate meetings where we discuss more operational topics and where we try to spend more time on strategic topics. And we also try to put disproportionate amount of time. So the operational meetings are shorter, whereas the strategic meetings are longer. But again, I think it's a mindset. We need to be open to change. And in June, my son was studying for his biology exam, and they were talking about. My wife was interrogating him, and they were talking about the survival of the fittest, the book of, the Origin of Species, the book of Darwin. And in that book, he talks about survival of the fittest. But what is interesting is that he doesn't talk about the fittest as being the strongest again. He talks about the fittest as being the one who's most adaptable to change. So thinking about what is the core DNA that we must maintain and what is it that we do. And when I look at then back into our business organization, my question is almost how do I bring that into life? And there's an analogy I use with the dance floor and the balcony. I think we are continuously dancing on the dance floor, and we sometimes do not see whether this is in harmony, whether this is going in the right direction. We don't even see what's happening on the other side of the dance floor. And that's why we need to go to the balcony to see and to readjust. And so, although I spend more of my time on the balcony, I want to invite my leadership team to spend more time with me on the balcony, but then also make it back to the dance floor, and that we then all dance together in harmony.
And creating the safe space and the time that they have the ability to go and do that and not get. I think it's an important point that you create kind of different meetings, which is really different space, a different environment for which your team can think about the future. Because otherwise you just get pulled back into the day-to-day and you leave it for 5 minutes on the end of the day, or it's a Friday afternoon discussion when you're 4 o'clock and you're wrapping up for the weekend, right? And you're not really thinking too deliberately about it.
Now, Phil, I bet you if you would go around here and you would ask 50 people in procurement, they will all have a different future. And I would say that all of them are right. And that's a bit the problem, nobody has the answer. People sometimes look at you as the head of the function to say, so what's the answer? Where do we need to go? I don't know. I'm discovering it together with you. And I think that's something also that we need to create as an atmosphere, being honest towards our team, saying, we might go left now, but 2 months from now, maybe a year from now, we might go back right. And so we need to be humble about the fact that we don't know the answers, that we are discovering, but that we are courageous to at least lead the way for change.
It's like you're engaging in a series of experiments.
Yes.
Which will ultimately provide a data-driven path, but you don't necessarily know what that is until you've tried the experiments.
It's interesting you bring up the experiments because one of the key traits that or competencies that I tell my team that we need to be is we need to be more like scientists. A scientist actually has a hypothesis, that believes that if we do this, then that is going to happen. And they'll do an experiment to see what the outcome is.
Yeah.
And actually, they often do the experiment to be proven wrong on their hypotheses.
Yeah.
And I think the same should apply for us here as well. And I think here, I mean, again, coming back to some of the topics we see here at DPW or some of the solutions, everything in its own right makes sense. They all answer a specific challenge or a specific need or something. The question is just what's the right one for your organization. Because your environment is totally different than my environment, is totally different than somebody else's environment. And I think that's the biggest challenge. There is no right or wrong.
No, and it's funny, I think that we went through a spell in procurement of trying to centralize, standardize, like say, well, procurement's the same in any business. So we have the same process, we fit this same technology in the same process, and everybody who isn't following that process, which is the best-in-class process, is doing it wrong. And the reality is, as you say, there really isn't one right way of doing it. Every organization is different. And people might look at that and say, well, you say that as an excuse, as a cop-out for not going and investing in these things or doing these things. But if we're aligning what we do with what the business needs, every business needs something a little bit different from what a procurement group can bring.
And I think that's a bit a complexity that we have created for many years. I mean, if you think about it, traditionally, a procurement department had like a category setup. And so we would organize ourselves around markets and around spend categories, which would make sense from whatever point of view. Now, I still believe that that's important. You need to have a depth of knowledge or a deep expertise in specific areas. But I also do believe that we need to start evolving much more towards a business-centric approach. And I think what this will result into is much more of a matrixed organization. Now, again, I think, although you could argue to your point that, we need to have different solutions for different problems, and we also need to avoid that we don't create chaos.
Yes.
Because, again, to a certain extent, what we also need to do is manage complexity. And I think that's finding
create
that
complexity.
Not
We don't
create
want to
one.
create more.
No. And so, again, a balance to strike is how much do you go for customization versus how much do you go for standardization? I think when we looked at technology for the past years, this has also been one of those things. For most people who have implemented technology on premise back in the days, had fully customized solutions.
Yeah.
And then you saw this wave towards the cloud, where suddenly the solution providers were pushing back on customization and saying, no, you got to follow our process. And I think that we're now finding a balance probably in that again. And I think that's something similar that we are seeing in procurement as well. We went from a very centralized process to a more decentralized process. And I think we'll be converging again at a certain point in time to something more hybrid in between.
Yeah, it's funny. I was actually thinking about this as I listened to a presentation yesterday, how, the maturity journey is decentralized to centralized, because we go from one extreme to the other, and then it goes center-led, and then we go back to decentralized. But if you do that in an organized way, there's a method to being decentralized, because you have process, governance, controls all the way around, devolving responsibility back into the business that you don't have when you decentralize here. It's like, is there a way to go from decentralized here to decentralized there and skip the bit in between when you're building, all this infrastructure?
I would argue there is. I mean, one of the things that we see is in Merck, we've actually introduced a different operating model a couple of years back, not only for procurement, but for many of the transversal functions. So the functions that are really going across all the business units that we have. Whereby, and I know, again, because ultimately you try to then fix it into an operating model, and then operating models and org charts never work with how, but ultimately the idea is that we want to find that balance between proximity to the business while still having a level of central expertise coming into play. So really creating that matrix, basically, whereby on one hand, we want to create more empowerment of the business to define what are the what's that we need to focus on, but then to provide a bit more structure as well into the how this goes along, again, to balance that complexity versus decentralization. I think it helps. Now, the only challenge that you will always find, it has nothing to do with org charts, it has nothing to do with reporting lines, it has to do with mindset. It's if you're in procurement and you don't have a business focus, then I would argue you should not be in procurement. And therefore, I would argue that back in the days, I mean, we were doing business partnering as well, maybe not to the level or to the extent that we do it today, but we were doing it as well.
Yep.
And so what is different now is nothing more than we now institutionalize it into an org chart, but we try to institutionalize a mindset, and that doesn't work. And so I think what is challenging or preventing us from going from decentralized to decentralized, and I wouldn't call it decentralized,
Right.
but
There's probably another
business-centric.
term for it, yes.
Because actually, I would go from decentralized to more business-centric.
Yeah.
I think that's a more a nicer term to speak about. If you go from decentralized to business-centric, I think the mindset is the evolution.
We talked beforehand around kind of some of the inhibitors to go on that journey and to break free from kind of the shackles of procurement of the past. And do you see that that's still kind of one of the biggest problems that we have in taking that journey, is that we're so entrenched in what procurement used to be that it's hard to, that provides some level of comfort. And there's this fear about moving into the future.
Nostalgia is a great blanket. Whenever we find ourselves into a difficult or challenging situation, I think we want to have stability. What is interesting is that if you look 10 years ago, we were talking about VUCA, and that the world would be VUCA. Interesting thing was that when COVID hit us, we realized that VUCA hit us as individuals. The world became volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. And I think that's the opposite of what humans are looking for. I think us as human beings, we are trying to look for stability. We're trying to look for predictability.
Routine, consistency.
I mean that's everything in our lives. It is about that. I mean, of course, you have the adventurers who like to seek up and push the limits, but I think that the majority of us are not like that. And so I think that that's one of the key inhibitors that we see, is the fact that we feel comfortable in what we do, and that we are scared of the unknown. Again, what if tomorrow we no longer will do sourcing? I mean, I have people in the team who have been doing or working in procurement for all their career, and they're now approaching a retirement age. I mean, what if tomorrow we tell them, well, what you've been doing for the past 30 years, you will no longer do?
Should we still be doing sourcing?
No. I need to nuance it a bit. I think, what is sourcing? I mean, if you purely talk about buying something, then I would say no, we should not buy something. Again, in the whole mindset or concept of spend entrepreneur is, how do we take something, invest it in somewhere else, and try to make the most out of it? I think that sourcing is a valuable tool to use. So I think sourcing will still be something that we have to do some sort, but not to the amount that we are still doing it today. And I think that in this, if we really deliver on that other sourcing, you also have different competencies that you will need for that. And I think here again, this is a question that we need to ask ourselves when we think about resource allocation. Today, you would probably argue that your majority of your teams are focused on around traditional procurement activities. If you think about what are the competencies that we'll need to be successful in 2030, then probably we need to develop new competencies, or we need to attract different type of people altogether into the organization, which again creates another type of stress and feeling of uncertainty for our teams. And I think that's not an easy one to live with.
It's difficult because we grow up with the notion that something is strategic when perhaps it wasn't. And I think about sourcing and the wrapper around sourcing that we call strategic sourcing. And that's not to say that all sourcing isn't strategic, but oftentimes it was a way of, it goes all the way back to, we talked about the inferiority complex. If we tell ourselves that something is strategic, then we believe that we are being strategic. And while a lot of sourcing, at the end of the day, with all the best will in the world, isn't that strategic, and it's something that very quickly we see all the technologies around us today will be able to do for us.
And strategy is also a very ambiguous concept. Yeah. What is strategic now is not strategic tomorrow. And I think that's a bit for me, it's what gives you a competitive advantage as an organization. Mm-hmm. And that is something that we can think about and then see in that light. I mean, depending on what is the reference framework that you want to do, then things become strategic. For your company tomorrow, sustainability is a key differentiator,
Yep.
then that becomes a strategic topic to go to, and it might totally overshadow.
So how do you, and perhaps it's a little easier in an organization the size of Merck that talks a lot publicly about its goals, but how do you truly understand what the business needs for you then to be able to extrapolate that back into the actions that procurement needs to take to make sure that you have that business centricity?
I think one of the key elements why I love procurement is that we're truly across the entire organization. I've to your point, I've been in different industries in my career. I started off in tourism, and I was working for a tour operator. And during my trainee program, I actually was educated as a host, the ones who hold the signs when you arrive on a holiday destination. I sat in a travel agency selling the trips in order to understand what customers need, so that when I was doing my role as buying the hotels, I understood what the trends were in the market, what my customers were looking for, and tried to translate that into what I was buying. The same thing afterwards, I've worked in the beer industry. I could explain to you the entire brewing process of beer. Of course, it's an interesting one, and that's probably, if in some industries it might be a bit different to have that same engagement in it, but still. And I think this is the beauty about procurement. I think as procurement, you need to be first and foremost, have a very strong business acumen. You need to be interested genuinely in what the business is doing and how it's making its money. And so it is having the opportunity to go and meet with customers, having the opportunity to meet, how products are being used. I remember when I was working for UCB in the pharmaceutical industry, we would try to visit hospitals. We would try to go, we had a very strong collaboration with World Health Organization. We try to visit those types of initiatives that we do to really understand how we as a company can make a difference. And when you understand how we as a company can make a difference for our customers, then I think as a procurement person, you can also judge better what it is that your suppliers can do to contribute to that.
Yeah, I remember back earlier in my career, I worked for Chiquita, the banana grower, and so went from plantation, followed it through the journey of being picked, packed, all the logistics, to then went to the port, flew to where the ship was coming to, and then followed it on its journey to the store. And being able to do things like that allows you to you better understand what kind of company you are, because you may look and say, well, a company like Chiquita, well, they grow bananas and sell bananas. Well, not really. They're a marketing and a logistics company.
Yeah. We have a great example in my team. In our surface business, we source mica. So mica is something that is used in pigments, basically to give that glossy feel. Now, you can just buy mica.
Yeah.
As a buyer, you could say, well, this is your category, this is mica. The team that is doing that for us actually has been on the ground, understands it. But what they've also noticed is that the way these things are sourced is not really in a sustainable way. The conditions in which the workers need to work is horrible. There's child labor that is sometimes involved into all this. So what they actually did is they started working with the suppliers to have access to schooling for the kids so that they would not have to go into a child labor. They had access to healthcare so that the overall communities would be developed. And ultimately, by working with suppliers like that, we managed to create one of the only sustainable mica sources. And that then suddenly becomes a competitive advantage for your commercial teams when they sell it into their customers. And I think that this is by understanding that trend, it's about knowing where to go.
You're thinking much bigger than a line item on a spreadsheet.
Yes.
Which is obviously the easy way to go and buy, but that's what a lot of organizations, a lot of people.
It would also
do.
be very boring if we only look at lines of spreadsheets. Seen too many spreadsheets in my life.
So I think every procurement person will join you in that one.
Maybe they can do here maybe there's a solution for spreadsheets.
Everybody can get rid of Excel.
Yes.
That's for sure. We're coming up to time to wrap up shortly, but I wanted to ask, we're here again at DPW with technology all around us. Technology on its own isn't necessarily, technology is not the silver bullet. Does people come first? Does process come first? Does technology come first? Do any of them come first? Or are you looking at kind of how are you bringing all that together, and each one being as equally as important as the other as you're looking at continuing to drive your model?
I would say none of them come first. I say problem comes first. Why do I say that? Is because, like I said, I can buy every solution here and try every solution. But the problem is you should have a problem first that you want to address. And the problems are always being solved by a combination of people, tools, and processes. If you look at, if you make a trade-off in that balance, you will end up with an imperfect solution for your problem. But again, I think you need to work on all three. And I think, processes and technology are probably more simple to work on because people requires more of an emotional connection. And so processes and technology we can do with our brains, people will have to do from the heart. And I think that's where we find that balance.
Coming together of the art and the science
Yes.
of procurement.
Yes.
Well, on that note, Sebastien, I want to thank you so much
Thanks
for joining
having
me.
me,
I've loved
Phil.
the conversation.
Yeah, me too.
And I want to thank everybody at DPW for making this possible. We're looking forward to checking out the rest of the event over the next day or two.
Yeah, going to be exciting.
Until then, we'll see you again on Art of Procurement. Thank you very much.